July 1878, Blackwood Saloon, Montana Territory. Sign it. And your father's debt disappears forever. Josiah Galt smirked as he shoved the pen toward Evelyn Reed. Her face had turned pale, but her chin stayed high, refusing to let her trembling hand betray her. Just as the pen touched the paper, bang, the saloon door flew open. Silas Vance's scarred mountain man, with a crippled leg strode inside, slammed a heavy leather pouch onto the table, then ripped the contract clean in half. She doesn't belong to you. Galt's smile vanished. His eyes burned with rage. You just signed your own death warrant. Vance, why would a man who had hidden in the mountains for 14 years risk everything to save a woman he'd never met? Stay with me until the very end, and don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications for more unforgettable Western stories. The saloon was hot enough to make a man forget his own name. Blackwood in July did that to a room full of bodies and whiskey and bad intentions. Dust hung in the light coming through the slats, turning gold, turning slow, like it had nowhere better to be. Evelyn Reed stood at the bar with her spine straight as a fence post. She had worn her best dress. It didn't matter now. Sweat stuck to her back, but she'd worn it anyway. Some things a person did out of habit, even when habit made no sense. Her father used to say that. Stand up straight, Evie. Doesn't cost you a thing, and it costs them plenty. Her father was 3 weeks dead. Josiah Galt sat behind the table, like he owned the air in the room, which, in Blackwood, he mostly did. He had a ledger open in front of him, the pages soft and worn from handling, and a pen resting beside it like a loaded gun waiting for a hand. Your daddy owed this town a great deal, Miss Reed, he said. He didn't look up when he said it. Didn't need to. Land debts, interest on those debts. It adds up. My father paid every debt he ever owed. Then he kept poor records. Galt turned the ledger toward her. The numbers were neat. Too neat. Numbers written by a man who'd had plenty of quiet evenings alone to get them exactly wrong. This is the amount outstanding. You sign here. You work it off in my household. And the debt against your father's name is settled. His grave stays where it is. Nobody digs it up to sell the plot. A ripple went through the men standing along the walls. Somebody laughed low. Somebody else didn't. The saloon girls up on the landing had gone quiet, watching the way people watch a fire they aren't allowed to put out. Evelyn looked at the pen. She thought about her father's hands. Rough hands, a farmer's hands. Hands that had built the fence around their little house, board by board, because he didn't trust anybody else to do it right. Those hands hadn't owed Josiah Galt 1 red cent, and she knew it the way she knew her own name. But knowing a thing and proving it in a town Galt owned were two very different animals. She picked up the pen. Her hand did not shake. She made sure of that. Whatever else happened in this room, they would not get to say. The Reed girl's hand shook. The door banged open. It wasn't loud. Not really. Just the ordinary sound of wood against wood. But something in the room changed anyway. Footsteps came in from the street. Uneven ones. A heavy step. Then a lighter drag. Heavy. Then a drag. Like a metronome that had been kicked half to pieces and kept ticking regardless. Every head turned. Silas Vance filled the doorway before he ever crossed it. Tall. Wide through the shoulders. A scar cutting down through one eyebrow and across his cheek, like something had tried to split his face in two, and only half managed it. He wore a coat too heavy for the weather, and carried himself like a man who'd made peace with pain a long time ago and simply stopped mentioning it. Nobody in Blackwood had seen him come down off that mountain in over a year. He didn't look at Galt first. He looked at Evelyn, at the pen in her hand, at the ledger with its 2 neat numbers. Then he crossed the room, and the drag of his bad leg against the floorboards was the only sound anybody made. He set a leather pouch on the table. It landed heavy, heavier than a pouch that size had any right to sound. That covers it, he said. Galt's mouth curled. The start of something oily and rehearsed. Mr. Vance, this doesn't concern you. Made it my concern when I walked in. Silas reached down, picked up the ledger page with Evelyn's half-signature bleeding across the bottom of it, and tore it. Once, twice, he didn't do it for show. He did it the way a man tears up a bill he already paid. Plain and finished. And let the pieces fall on the table between them. For a second, Galt's face lost its shape entirely. The fury under it was real. Evelyn could see that much, boiling up hot behind his eyes before he wrestled it back down into something smoother. "That's a generous sum for a stranger's debt," Galt said. "Wasn't a debt. Was a robbery with better handwriting." Silas didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The room had gone still enough that he could have whispered and been heard in the back corner. "You want to argue that in front of a judge, Galt? You go right ahead and send for one. I'll wait." Nobody moved. Galt's hired men along the wall looked at each other, looked at their boss, looked at the size of Silas Vance's shoulders and the flat, cold patience in his eyes, and decided, one by one, that this wasn't the day. Galt swept the torn paper off the table, like it had never mattered to him at all. "Take her, then. She's yours." "She's not property," Silas said. "Nobody's." He turned and walked out. He didn't wait to see if Evelyn followed. He didn't order her to. He simply walked, the drag of his leg marking time against the floor, and left the door standing open behind him, with the bright square of daylight cutting into all that saloon gloom. Evelyn stood there a moment. Galt was watching her, waiting to see if she'd flinch, if she'd thank him, if she'd do anything at all that gave him back the upper hand he'd just lost. She didn't give him a single thing. She set down the pen. She smoothed the front of her dress, unhurried, the way a woman does when she wants the room to know she is leaving because she chooses to, not because anybody told her to move. Then she walked out into the sun. Silas was waiting by a horse at the edge of the street, not looking at her, looking off toward the mountains, like he was already halfway gone, up close in daylight. The scar on his face was worse than it had looked in the saloon shadows, and his leg held him at an angle that spoke of old, deep damage, the kind that never fully healed and never let a man forget it either. "You didn't have to do that," Evelyn said. "Then why?" He looked at her then, really looked. The way a man looks at something he's deciding whether to trust. "Because a man's worth isn't measured in what he's owed," he said, "and neither is a woman's. Galt's been buying and selling people's dignity in this town for years and calling it business. Somebody had to walk in and call it what it was." Evelyn didn't answer right away. Behind her, through the open saloon door, she could still feel Galt's eyes and the weight of every debt he'd ever forged against people too poor or too scared to fight back. "I don't know you," she said finally. "No," Silas agreed. "You don't." He held out the reins toward her, not toward himself, an offering rather than a command, and said nothing further, letting the gesture speak whatever plain truth it needed to. Evelyn Reed looked at the mountain, rising blue and distant behind him, looked at the torn contract, still settling in pieces on a saloon floor she was never going back to, and took the reins. The trail out of Blackwood climbed fast. Within an hour, the town had shrunk to a smudge of gray roofs behind them, and within two, the air had turned thin and sharp enough to burn going down. Evelyn rode behind Silas on a borrowed mare, her hands tight on the reins, watching the back of his coat sway with the uneven rhythm of his stride whenever he walked the horse over rough ground. He didn't talk much. She was starting to understand that about him. Words cost him something, and he spent them carefully, the way a poor man spends coin. "How far to your place?" she asked, mostly to break the silence, which had started to feel less like peace and more like a held breath. "Far enough." "That's not an answer. It's the only one I've got today." She let it drop. The mountain was doing most of the talking anyway, groaning under a wind that hadn't decided yet whether it wanted to be a breeze or something worse. By mid-afternoon, it had decided. The first snow came sideways, not the gentle kind that drifted down, like something out of a Christmas card, but a hard, driving spray that stung any bare skin it touched and turned the trail into a gray blur within minutes. Evelyn's mare balked, ears flat, and Silas was off his horse and at her bridle before she had time to be afraid. "We're not stopping," he shouted over the wind. "Cabin's another hour. We stop here. We don't get up again." I can ride. I know you can. Stay close. He didn't wait to see if she agreed. He simply started walking, leading both horses now, his bad leg punishing him with every step, and his face giving away nothing about it. Evelyn watched him from the saddle, watched the way the wind tried to knock him sideways, and the way he leaned into it instead, stubborn as a fence post, refusing to give the mountain the satisfaction. An hour in that weather felt longer than most entire days. The cold worked its way through her coat, through her dress, down into places she hadn't known could get cold. Her fingers went numb around the reins. Twice, she thought she might slide right off the horse without even noticing she'd done it. That was how far away her body had started to feel. Then Silas stopped in front of her, turned, and without asking, pulled his own coat off. "I don't need it," she said, teeth chattering hard enough to break the sentence into pieces. Wasn't asking. He draped it over her shoulders anyway, rough hands surprisingly careful about it, tucking the collar up around her neck. Underneath, he wore only a thin wool shirt, and the wind cut into him without mercy. But he didn't flinch. Or if he did it somewhere she couldn't see. Big difference between needing and wanting to freeze to prove a point. You're not proving anything up here, except how stubborn you are. And I already worked that out back in the saloon. She wanted to argue. She was too cold to manage it. She pulled the coat tighter instead and said nothing. And something about his silence afterward felt like he understood exactly what her silence meant. They reached the cabin as the light was dying. It sat in a stand of pines, low and squat, smoke already curling from a chimney that some part of Evelyn's exhausted mind registered as strange, since nobody had been home to light it. Later she'd learn. Silas kept the fire banked low and burning through every storm, a habit from years of not knowing when he'd come stumbling back through that door, half frozen and needing warmth waiting for him. He got the horses into a lean-to shed, moving fast despite his leg, throwing blankets over their backs before he even looked at himself. Then he pushed open the cabin door and waved her in ahead of him. The inside was small, one room, mostly, a stone hearth on one wall, a rope bed in the corner, a table that had seen better decades, and shelves lined with things that told her more about the man than any conversation had. Books, a lot of them, worn soft at the spines, a rifle over the door, and on a shelf near the bed, half hidden behind a tin cup, something that caught the firelight and glinted gold for just a second before Silas moved between her and it, blocking her view without seeming to mean to. "Sit," he said, nodding toward the hearth. "I'll get the fire built up." She sat. She was too cold and too tired to do otherwise. She watched him work the fire, watched the ease in his hands, even when the rest of him moved stiff and pained, and thought that a man who could build a fire that gentle out of half-frozen kindling probably had more patience in him than his face let on. When the flames were finally roaring, he straightened, favoring the bad leg, and reached into his coat, the one still wrapped around her shoulders, and pulled something free from an inside pocket. A key, small, iron, plain. He held it out to her. "That's the only key to that door," he said. "Front door's the only way in or out that doesn't involve breaking a window. And I built those windows too small for a grown man to fit through on purpose." Evelyn looked at the key, then at him. "Why are you giving this to me?" "Because it's yours now." He said it plain. No ceremony to it. The way another man might mention the weather. "Your freedom is yours. I didn't buy you to lock you in a cage. That key is your choice. You want to leave in the morning. Walk down that mountain. I'll saddle a horse for you myself and not say a word against it. You want to stay. That's your choice, too. Either way, it's not mine to make for you." She closed her hand around the key. It was cold at first, then slowly warmed against her palm. "Most men who buy a woman out of a debt don't hand her the key to the front door," she said. "Most men who'd let a girl sign herself into that kind of debt in the first place aren't men I've got much use for." He turned away from her then, back toward the fire, and retreated to the far corner of the room, the coldest spot, farthest from the hearth, and settled onto a low stool, like he'd claimed that corner for himself on purpose, leaving the warmth of the fire entirely to her. Evelyn sat there a long while, the key in her fist, watching the flames throw shadows across the hard planes of his face. He didn't look at her again that night. He looked at the fire, or at nothing, or at whatever memories a man carried up a mountain and never spoke of. And eventually she understood that his silence wasn't coldness. It was the only kind of gift a man like that knew how to give. Space, distance, the absence of demand. She fell asleep on a folded blanket near the hearth with the key still in her hand. And if Silas moved at all that night, she never heard it. The days that followed fell into a shape neither of them planned, but both seemed to accept. Evelyn woke on the third morning to the sound of an axe splitting wood outside, rhythmic and steady, the kind of sound that told a person exactly how a man felt, even when his face gave nothing away. She pulled on her boots and went out into air so cold it hurt to breathe, and found Silas at the woodpile, sleeves rolled despite the temperature, sweat on his brow from the effort of compensating for a leg that didn't want to cooperate with heavy labor. "I can do that," she said. He didn't stop swinging. "You've never split wood a day in your life. That's not a reason not to learn." He glanced at her then, something almost like amusement flickering across that scarred, guarded face. "It's dangerous. Axe slips, you lose fingers. So teach me not to let it slip." For a moment, she thought he'd refuse outright, the way men often did when a woman offered to do something they'd already decided wasn't hers to do. Instead, he set the axe down, wiped his palms on his trousers, and waved her over. "Feet apart," he said, "wider than you think you need. Grip low on the handle. Let it slide up through your hands as you swing. Don't muscle it. Let the weight do the work." She picked up the axe. It was heavier than it looked, the balance of it strange in her hands. But she planted her feet the way he'd shown her and swung. She missed the log entirely. The axe head buried itself in the dirt beside it, and she nearly went down with the momentum, catching herself hard enough to jar her teeth. Silas didn't laugh. She'd half expected him to, the way some men laughed at a woman's failures, to prove some point about her place. But he only stepped in close behind her, close enough that she felt the warmth radiating off him despite the cold, and put his hands over hers on the handle. "Again," he said, "slower this time. Let me feel where you're going wrong." They swung together, once, twice, and on the third, try something clicked. Some understanding of weight and angle that her body absorbed faster than her mind could explain it. And the axe bit clean into the log and split it in two. "There it is," he said, stepping back. Evelyn stared at the split wood like it was the finest thing she'd ever made. Again. By mid-morning, her hands had blistered, and her shoulders ached in ways she'd never known shoulders could ache. And she'd split enough wood to keep the cabin warm for a week. Silas watched her from the porch step, arms crossed, something in his expression she couldn't quite name and didn't try very hard to. That afternoon, she found the garden plot behind the cabin. Hard frozen soil that, Silas said, had gone unworked for 2 winters running, and announced she intended to till it comes spring, whether he thought that was a fool notion or not. "Ground's rocky up here," he said. "Won't grow much. It'll grow something. Something's better than nothing." She crouched down and dug her fingers into the frozen dirt anyway, testing it, stubborn as ever. "My mother kept a garden even in a drought year once," said the trying mattered as much as the harvest. Said a person who stops trying because the ground's hard has already decided who they are. And it's usually somebody smaller than they could have been. Silas watched her a long moment. "Your mother sounds like she had some backbone." She did. "I like to think some of it took. Looks like plenty of it took." That evening, over a supper of beans and salt pork that Evelyn insisted on cooking, despite never having cooked over an open hearth in her life, the silence between them started to feel different. Less like a wall, more like a room. 2 people were slowly learning to share the furniture of. "You don't talk much about before," she said, watching the fire instead of him, giving him room to answer or not. "Not much worth saying. 14 years is a long time to have nothing worth saying about it." His jaw tightened, just slightly, the scar along his cheek pulling with the motion. Some things a man carries alone, not because he wants to, because putting them into words makes them realer than he can stand some days. I understand that better than you'd think. He looked at her then, really looked, and for a moment something passed between them that neither one named out loud. Understanding, maybe, or the beginning of it. The kind two wounded people find when they finally stop performing for each other and just sit still in the same quiet. Your father, Silas said slowly. The one Galt says owed him. What was he like? Evelyn's throat tightened. She hadn't spoken of her father since before the funeral. Hadn't let herself. Because grief postponed had a way of becoming grief managed. And managed grief was the only kind she could afford right now. He built things, she said finally. Fences, furniture, a whole house with his own two hands. Out of nothing. Because nobody else believed in that land the way he did. He used to say, a man who builds something with his hands leaves proof of himself in the world that no lie in a ledger can erase. Her voice caught. Galt erased him anyway. Took the fence, took the house, took the land, and turned 30 years of my father's proof into a stack of forged paper. He didn't erase him, Silas said quietly. Not while you're still standing here telling me about him. Evelyn looked up, surprised by the gentleness in it. More surprised by how much she needed to hear it. You believe that? I've buried better men than Galt will ever be, and watched worse men prosper off their graves. Belief's got nothing to do with fairness up here. But no, he's not erased. A man's not gone so long as somebody remembers what he built and why. They sat with that a while, the fire cracking, the wind outside finally settling into something almost gentle. Evelyn thought, not for the first time, that Silas Vance carried grief the same way he carried his bad leg, without complaint, without asking anyone to slow down for him, simply absorbing the weight of it into his stride and moving forward anyway. It was 2 days later, while Evelyn was cleaning the cabin, sweeping years of dust from corners that clearly hadn't seen a broom in longer than she wanted to guess, that she found the lockbox. It had been shoved under a loose floorboard near the bed, half hidden. The kind of hiding a man does when he wants a thing safe, but not so far gone, he can never reach it again. The lock was old and simple, more habit than real security. And it gave way when she nudged it, not meaning to pry, only meaning to move it aside so she could sweep beneath. Inside sat a tarnished silver star, us Marshall's badge, the edges worn smooth from years of a thumb rubbing over them, and beneath it, a stack of papers, their edges brittle, their ink faded but still legible. Ledgers, names, dates, and Josiah Galt's signature, over and over, next to numbers that had nothing to do with any real debt, and everything to do with a man systematically stealing land from people who had no way to fight back. One page, near the bottom of the stack, made her hand go still. Her father's name, a date 3 weeks before he died, a notation in a hand that wasn't her father's, describing an arrangement to be made permanent by whatever means necessary. Evelyn sat on the floor a long time, the papers in her lap, understanding settling over her slow and cold as the mountain outside. Silas hadn't found her by accident in that saloon. He'd been waiting, 14 years on this mountain, isolated, nursing a leg that never healed right. And the whole time, he'd been holding on to proof of exactly the kind of corruption that had killed her father, waiting for the moment, or the reason, or maybe just the courage, to finally walk back down and use it. She heard his uneven footsteps outside, coming toward the cabin door, and she didn't hide what she'd found. She simply sat there with the ledgers open in her lap and waited for him to see. He stopped in the doorway. His eyes went to the papers, then to her face, and something in him seemed to brace itself the way a man braces for a blow he's earned and can't avoid. How long have you had these? She asked. Not an accusation, a question that needed an honest answer. Since before I left the service. He came inside, shut the door against the cold, and lowered himself onto the stool across from her, his bad leg stretched out stiff. I was the marshal who investigated Galt the first time, found enough to hang him twice over. Judge he'd already bought, made sure none of it saw daylight. Cost me my badge, cost me this leg courtesy of men Galt, sent to make sure I understood the lesson. And I came up here because I didn't have anywhere else worth going. And I wasn't finished. 14 years. Waiting on the right moment, right witness, right proof that couldn't be bought or buried the way everything else in that town gets bought or buried. He looked at her steady. No apology in it, but no hardness either. Your father's name is in there because Galt's been doing this for 2 decades, not because I had anything to do with what happened to him. I want you to know that clear. I've hated myself plenty of years for not finding a way to stop him sooner. I won't add your father's death to that list falsely, but I won't pretend. I don't carry the weight of every name in that ledger. I couldn't save in time either. Evelyn looked down at her father's name on the page, and something in her chest that had been quietly grieving in private suddenly had a direction to point itself in. Then let's finish it, she said, whatever it takes. Silas studied her for a long moment, something shifting behind his eyes. Respect, maybe, or recognition. The look of a man realizing he was no longer carrying this alone. It'll be dangerous, he said. Galt won't go quiet if he finds out this still exists. My father didn't go quiet either. I don't intend to. That night, after Silas had banked the fire and retreated to his corner, Evelyn lay awake, turning an idea over in her mind. Careful and quiet. The way a person handles something fragile. They're not yet ready to speak aloud. In the morning, when the supply driver's wagon came rattling up the lower trail on its regular route, she was waiting at the tree line with a folded letter and a plea in her eyes that needed no explanation. Federal Marshal's office, she told him, pressing the letter and a few coins into his weathered hand. Please, it has to reach them. The driver, an older man who'd clearly seen enough of Blackwood's dealings to recognize desperation when it stood in front of him, nodded once and tucked the letter deep inside his coat. Ain't seen you, he said. Didn't take nothing from nobody. She watched his wagon disappear down the mountain trail, snow beginning to dust the ruts behind his wheels, and felt something she hadn't felt since the day of her father's funeral. Not peace exactly, but motion. The sense that grief, finally, had somewhere useful to go. She didn't tell Silas what she'd done. Not yet. Some things a person needed to set into motion quietly, and trust that the mountain and the man beside her would understand when the moment finally came. The letter reached its destination faster than either of them could have hoped, though neither Silas nor Evelyn knew that yet. What they knew, 3 weeks later, was that Josiah Galt had a way of hearing things he shouldn't hear, and that Blackwood had never been a town where secrets stayed buried long. It started with a rider. Silas spotted him first. A lone figure working his way up the lower switchbacks at a pace too careful to be innocent. He'd been out checking snares near the tree line, and something in the man's posture, the way he kept glancing back down the trail like he was counting how many more were coming behind him, put a cold weight in Silas's gut that had nothing to do with the temperature. He made it back to the cabin at a near run, legs screaming the whole way. Get inside, he told Evelyn. Bar the door. Don't open it unless you hear my voice and nobody else's. What's happening? Galt knows. He was already pulling the rifle down from over the door, checking the load, with hands that had done this 1,000 times before and never once enjoyed it. Somebody talked, or somebody saw you at that supply wagon. Doesn't matter which now. Evelyn's stomach dropped, but she didn't argue, didn't waste time asking questions that wouldn't change what came next. She helped him drag the table across the door instead. Helped him check the 2 windows small enough that no grown man could climb through. And when he handed her a second rifle from the lockbox, she took it without hesitation and checked the load herself, the way he'd shown her weeks before. On a quiet afternoon neither of them had known would matter this much. You know how to use that, he said. It wasn't a question. You taught me. I taught you to hit a stump at 30 paces. This isn't a stump. Then I'll aim careful. He almost smiled, almost. The moment didn't leave much room for it. They didn't have long to wait. The riders came up out of the tree line in the last gray light of afternoon. 6 of them, moving with the loose, confident sprawl of men who'd been paid well and expected the job to be easy. Galt's men. Silas recognized 2 of them from town. Hired guns with more meanness than sense. The kind who'd shoot a man in the back and call it a fair fight, because nobody was left standing to argue. Vance, one of them called out, reining up at the edge of the clearing. Galt wants what's in that lockbox. Hand it over peaceful, and you and the girl walk away clean. Man who burns down half a town for money doesn't know the meaning of clean. Silas called back through a gap in the shuttered window. Turn around and ride home. Nobody needs to bleed today. The answer came in the form of a rifle shot that splintered wood an inch from his head. After that, there was no more talking. The fight that followed didn't unfold the way stories usually told it. Clean and heroic, with clear lines between the brave and the wicked. It was loud and ugly and confused. Gun smoke thick enough to sting the eyes. Men shouting orders that got lost in the wind. Horses screaming when stray shots caught them by accident. Evelyn fired from the window slot Silas had built into the cabin wall years before, for exactly this kind of night. And the recoil punished her shoulder every time. But she kept firing anyway, because stopping wasn't a choice either of them had. Silas fought like a man who'd done this before and hated every second of having to do it again. His bad leg kept him from moving the way he once could, kept him rooted in place when instinct told him to duck and roll. But what the leg cost him in speed. Decades of training gave back in precision. 3 of Galt's men went down before they made it halfway across the clearing. A 4th turned tail and rode hard back down the mountain, deciding whatever Galt was paying wasn't worth a bullet in the chest. The 5th caught Silas in the shoulder. The shot spun him half around, slammed him back against the doorframe. And for one terrible second, Evelyn thought she'd watch him fall right there in front of her. He didn't. He braced himself against the frame, blood already soaking dark through his shirt, and put the 5th man down with a single shot before his knees finally buckled under him. The 6th man broke and ran. Silence came down over the clearing after that, the particular ringing quiet that follows gunfire, broken only by the wind and the whimper of a wounded horse somewhere in the trees. Evelyn scrambled out from behind the table, rifle still in her hand, and dropped to her knees beside Silas, where he'd slid down against the doorframe. Silas, his eyes were open, glassy with pain and blood loss, but open, bleeding some. He managed. Not the first time. You could have told me it hurt. Would have slowed me down. Thinking about it. She got him inside. Got pressure on the wound. Tore strips from her own petticoat to bind it, because there wasn't time to be modest about fabric when a man was losing blood by the cupful. He fought to stay conscious through most of it, gritting his teeth, refusing to make a sound that might frighten her worse than she already was. And by the time she had the wound packed and bound as best she knew how, the fight had drained the last of his strength, and he slipped under, unconscious, his breathing shallow but steady. Evelyn sat beside him through the fading afternoon, rifle across her lap, listening to the wind pick back up outside and knowing, with a certainty that settled cold and clear in her mind, that the 6th man wouldn't ride all the way back to Blackwood before Galt sent more. She was right. The blizzard hit sometime after dark, the kind of storm that swallowed sound and sight both, and it was under cover of that howling white chaos that the cabin door came apart at the hinges. The wood splintered inward with a crack louder than any gunshot. Snow and wind roared into the room, and in the doorway, backlit by the last gray light of the storm, stood a shape too large to be anything but trouble. A man in a heavy coat, a scar of his own across one cheek that told Evelyn plainly he was the kind Galt kept on retainer for jobs too ugly for the ordinary hired gun. He carried a revolver, cocked, and he leveled it without hesitation at the unconscious man on the floor. At Silas, the barrel found its mark. The assassin's finger found the trigger. The cabin door hung broken behind him, the storm howling through the gap. And for one long, suspended moment, the entire world seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see whether Silas Vance would die on his own cabin floor after 14 years of waiting for justice he'd never lived to see delivered. Evelyn did not scream. She would think about that later, in quieter moments. Marvel at it even. The fact that, in the space of that frozen second, her body had made a decision her mind hadn't fully caught up to yet. There was no time for fear to take the wheel. There was only the assassin's shape filling the doorway, the revolver leveling at Silas's head, and the cold certainty that if she didn't move in the next half-second, everything the two of them had built on this mountain died right here on this floor. She backed toward the hearth, slow, careful, every instinct screaming to run. Every scrap of sense she had left telling her that running would only draw his eye faster. Beneath the floorboards, in the spot Silas had shown her only once, half joking, half serious, in case you ever need it, and I'm not standing, there was a revolver, heavy, loaded, waiting. Her hand found the loose board. Her fingers found the cold metal beneath it. The assassin's eyes flicked toward the movement. She didn't think. Thinking would have cost her the half-second she didn't have. She pulled the revolver free, brought it up in both trembling hands, and fired. The recoil threw her backward into the hearthstones hard enough to knock the air from her lungs. The shot itself was deafening in the small room, a physical blow of sound that left her ears ringing, and the world momentarily swimming. She'd aimed for center mass, the way Silas had taught her on quiet afternoons that had felt, at the time, like nothing more than practical caution. The shot caught the assassin high in the chest. He staggered, didn't fall, and the revolver in his hand swung toward her instead of Silas. What followed wasn't clean. It wasn't the kind of fight described in dime novels, all grace and easy heroism. It was raw and desperate and messy. Two bodies grappling across a blood-slicked floor, the assassin's greater size and strength nearly overwhelming her. Twice before her fingers found the fallen poker from beside the hearth and swung it hard against the side of his skull. He went down. He didn't get back up. Evelyn scrambled backward from him, chest heaving, revolver still clutched in one shaking hand, poker in the other. And for a long moment, she simply stared at what she'd done, at the blood on the floor, at the stillness of the man she'd just killed to save the life of another. Silas stirred behind her. Evelyn, his voice was weak, rasping, but it was his, and it was the single most welcome sound she'd ever heard in her life. She turned to find him struggling up onto one elbow, pale from blood loss but conscious, eyes wide and fixed on her with an expression she couldn't quite name. "Don't move," she said, dropping the poker, crossing to him fast. "You'll open the wound again. What happened? He came for you while you were down." I stopped him. Silas's gaze went past her, to the still shape near the doorway, to the blood, to the revolver, still trembling in her grip, and something shifted in his face. Not shock exactly, something closer to reverence. The look of a man revising everything he'd believed he understood about the woman kneeling in front of him. "You killed him." "I didn't have a choice." "No," he agreed, quiet. "You didn't. And you didn't hesitate either. That's more than I can say for plenty of grown men I served alongside." She looked down at her hands, still shaking, blood on them that wasn't her own, and waited to feel the horror she assumed should be coming. The collapse into tears or sickness that a proper young lady was supposed to feel after taking a life. It didn't come. What came instead was a strange, steady clarity, the understanding that she had done what needed doing, and that regret, if it came at all, would come later and on its own schedule. Not because anyone expected it of her now. "I'm not sorry," she said, half to herself. "Is that wrong?" No, Silas's hand found hers. Weak, but certain. "It's not wrong to protect what matters to you. Man who comes into your home, meaning to kill, has already spent his claim on your mercy. You didn't do anything wrong tonight, Evelyn. You did the only right thing there was left to do." She helped him back against the wall, checked his bandages, found them holding despite everything. And only then, with the immediate danger past, did her hands finally stop shaking quite so hard. Outside, the blizzard raged on, indifferent to what had just happened inside those cabin walls. And somewhere down the mountain, in a warm office in Blackwood, Josiah Galt would soon learn that his best chance to bury the truth of what he'd done had died in the snow, along with the man he'd sent to make sure of it. Evelyn sat beside Silas through the rest of that long night, revolver within reach, watching the door, and thought about every story she'd ever heard growing up about women needing rescue, needing protection, needing a man's strength standing between them and the world's cruelty. She thought about her mother's garden in the drought year, about her father's hands building a fence board by board, about every quiet lesson from a childhood that had taught her, without ever saying so outright, that a person's worth wasn't measured by how well they waited to be saved. She had not waited tonight. She had acted. And somewhere in the exhausted, blood-streaked hours before dawn, she understood that something in her had changed for good. Some old idea about her own limitations burned away as surely as the contract Silas had torn to pieces on a saloon table weeks before. By morning, the storm had passed. The mountain lay hushed and white under sky scrubbed clean, and Silas was breathing easier. Color returning slowly to his face as fever gave way to simple exhaustion. "You saved my life," he said, when he finally had the strength for more than a few words at a time. "You saved mine first. In that saloon, that's different, is it?" She wrung out a cloth in the basin beside the bed, pressed it gentle against his brow. "Seems to me we're square now, or getting there." He looked at her a long moment, something working behind his eyes that she couldn't quite read, and didn't try to argue the point any further. The days after the attack moved slow, the way days do when a person is healing, and the world outside has narrowed down to the small, patient business of getting well. Silas's fever broke on the third day. By the fifth, he could sit up without Evelyn's help. By the seventh, he was arguing with her about whether he was well enough to split wood again, an argument he lost soundly and without much real fight in it. Something had shifted between them since that night. Neither of them named it out loud. Not at first. It showed up instead in small things. The way he watched her cross the room now, a little longer than strictly necessary. The way she found reasons to sit close by while she mended his shirts or read to him from one of his worn books, closer than the work required. It was 2 weeks later, on an evening when the wind outside had finally gone quiet and the fire burned low and steady, that the careful distance between them finally gave way. They'd been talking, the ordinary kind of talking that had become easy between them by now, about the garden she meant to plant come the thaw, about a book he'd been meaning to finish for 3 winters running and never had, and then in the pause that followed, in the particular hush of a cabin at night with the fire crackling and nowhere else in the world either of them needed to be. Evelyn had reached over and taken his hand. He didn't pull away. Not at first. "Evelyn, don't," she said softly. "Don't tell me this is a mistake. I've had enough of people telling me what I'm allowed to want." His jaw tightened, the scar along his cheek catching the firelight. "I'm not the kind of man women dream about. Look at me. Leg that doesn't work right. Face that scares children in town. I'm 14 years older than you, and every one of those years shows. I've looked at you every day for over a month." She didn't let go of his hand. "I've watched you carry more weight than any man should have to carry, and do it without complaint, and still find room in yourself to hand a stranger the key to her own freedom the first night you met her. I know exactly what you are. Silas Vance. I don't need you to tell me. You deserve better than a broken old lawman hiding on a mountain. Stop telling me what I deserve. Let me decide that for myself." He looked at her a long moment, the old guard in his eyes finally, visibly, beginning to crack. Decades of believing himself unworthy of exactly this kind of tenderness starting to give way under the plain. Steady certainty in her face. She closed the distance between them. What followed was not something either of them had planned, but neither did it feel like a mistake to either of them once it began. It felt, instead, like the natural conclusion of everything that had passed between them since that first night on the mountain. The key pressed into her palm, the wood split side by side, the ledgers opened together, the gunfire survived together. 2 people who had each, in their own private and separate ways, given up on being seen fully by anyone again, finding in each other exactly that. Silas hesitated once more, his hand hovering just short of her. Old insecurity rising up one last time. "I don't have much left to offer a woman like you. Just this cabin, this mountain, a body that doesn't work the way it used to. You keep talking like I'm asking for something you don't already have plenty of." Evelyn didn't retreat. She met his eyes, steady, and let him see there wasn't a trace of pity in her, only the plain, fierce want of a woman who had made up her own mind about what she valued and wasn't interested in being argued out of it. I'm not asking for a whole man by somebody else's measure. I'm asking for you, exactly as you are. Whatever remained of his hesitation didn't survive that. The fire burned low through the rest of the night, and outside the wind settled into the kind of stillness the mountain rarely offered, as though even the weather understood there was nothing more it needed to test between them. What passed between Silas and Evelyn in the hours that followed was not spoken of in detail afterward, not because either of them regretted it, but because some things belonged only to the two people who lived them, private and whole, untouched by anyone else's need to know the particulars. What could be said, plainly, was this. Two people who had each spent years believing their worth was measured by scars, by debts, by the judgments of a world quick to price a person and slow to see them, found in each other proof of the opposite, that a body marked by hardship was not a lesser body, that a woman who had killed to protect what mattered to her was not somehow less gentle for it. That love, the real and lasting kind, had no interest in anyone's ledger of what a person was supposedly worth. Morning came soft and gray through the small cabin windows. Evelyn woke first, watching Silas sleep beside her, the hard lines of his face finally, briefly at rest. She thought of Galt's ledgers still hidden beneath the loose floorboard, of her father's name, written in a stranger's cruel hand, of the sixth man who'd fled back down the mountain and surely reported everything to a man who would not simply let this go. The fight ahead was far from finished. But for the first time since her father's death, Evelyn Reed woke without the hollow, grinding weight of grief sitting first and foremost in her chest. In its place sat something steadier, something worth protecting. Now, on both sides of the ledger, Silas stirred, opened his eyes, found her watching him. And, for the first time since she'd known him, Evelyn saw him smile without a trace of guard behind it. "Morning," he said. Morning, she settled back against him, listening to the quiet mountain outside, the danger still waiting somewhere down that long trail, and found she wasn't afraid of it, not with him beside her, not anymore. The thaw came slow, then all at once, the way mountain winters always seem to let go. One week the snow still lay deep in the shadowed places, and the next the creek behind the cabin was running loud and fast with meltwater, and the ground beneath Evelyn's boots had gone soft enough to work. She and Silas spent those first warm mornings packing what they'd need. Not much. A man who'd lived alone on a mountain for 14 years didn't own more than a couple of saddlebags could carry, and Evelyn had arrived with even less. But the lockbox went with them, wrapped careful in oilcloth and buried deep in Silas's saddlebag. The ledgers and the tarnished badge riding down the mountain, the same way they'd waited to for over a decade. "Patient, ready, you don't have to come," Silas told her, cinching the girth on her mare. "What's coming in that town won't be gentle. I signed my name away in that town once already," Evelyn said. "I'd like to be there when it stops meaning anything." He didn't argue further. He'd learned by now that arguing with her over what she was and wasn't capable of was a fight he generally lost, and lost deserving to. They rode down off the mountain as different people than the two who'd climbed it months before. Silas moved easier now. The wound in his shoulder healed to a thick, pale scar that joined the others without much fanfare. Evelyn rode with a rifle across her saddle and a steadiness in her spine that hadn't been there the day Galt forced a pen into her hand. They weren't 3 miles down the trail when they came across the trouble waiting for them. A wagon sat tipped on its side at the edge of a narrow farm road. One wheel shattered, a family's belongings scattered in the mud around it. A man Evelyn didn't recognize stood between the wreckage and 3 of Galt's hired guns, arms spread, shielding a woman and 2 children behind him with nothing but his own body and a voice gone raw from arguing. "This land's paid for," the farmer was shouting. "Paid for fair. And you know it. Galt says otherwise," one of the riders answered. Bored. Like this was the 40th time he'd said those words this month, and expected to say them 40 more. Says the note's overdue. Says you're off it by sundown, one way or another. Silas didn't hesitate. He put his heels to his horse and closed the distance fast, and Evelyn was right behind him, rifle already coming up off her saddle. That's enough, Silas said, reining up hard enough to throw dirt. Ride on back to Galt and tell him his forged notes don't carry weight out here anymore. The lead rider's hand drifted toward his holster, then stopped, calculating, when he got a good look at who he was facing. Word traveled fast in a small territory, even up a mountain, and the story of what had happened at that cabin during the blizzard had clearly made its way down every trail in the county by now. Nobody in Galt's employ was eager to be the next name added to that story. This ain't your fight, Vance. Everything Galt does with a forged pen is my fight. Has been 14 years now. Silas's voice didn't rise. Didn't need to. You want to test whether that's changed. Go right ahead. Otherwise, get off this family's land. The three riders exchanged a look, weighed the odds, and decided against them. They rode off without another word, and the farmer let out a breath he'd clearly been holding since the wagon first went over. Much obliged, he said, wiping mud from his hands. Didn't think anybody left in this territory had the nerve to stand against that man's hired guns. More do than you'd think, Silas said. They just need a reason to believe it'll matter. They helped right the wagon, helped gather the family's scattered belongings back into it, and Evelyn spent a good while crouched beside the two children, showing them how to fold a torn quilt so the tear wouldn't spread, talking soft and easy until the fright had drained clean out of their small faces. Why help us? The farmer's wife asked her, quiet, while the men worked on the wheel. You don't know us from strangers on the road. Because somebody helped me when I had nobody left to ask, Evelyn said. A person who's been shown what it cost to stand alone against something like Galt owes it to the next person to make sure they don't have to stand alone either. That's not charity. That's just what decent people are supposed to do for each other. The words settled over the little clearing, plain and unadorned, and the farmer's wife nodded slow, like she was filing the sentiment. Away someplace she meant to keep it, by the time they reached the outskirts of Blackwood 2 days later. Word of what Silas and Evelyn had done for the farming family had beaten them there. Small acts had a way of traveling faster than any newspaper, past farmhouse to farmhouse, town to town. Each retelling added a little more hope to people who'd gone a long while without much reason for it. Blackwood itself looked the same as it always had. Dusty streets, tired storefronts, Galt's name stamped somewhere on half the buildings in town. But something in the air had shifted. Evelyn could feel it the moment they rode in. People who once kept their eyes down when Galt's men passed now watched Silas and Evelyn ride through with something closer to open hope on their faces. A quiet rebellion had already begun before they ever set foot back in town, and Silas and Evelyn had simply given it a name to rally around. Word reached Galt before noon that his enemies had returned. By the time the church bell struck 12, half of Blackwood had gathered in the town square, drawn by rumor and restlessness both, sensing that whatever was coming wouldn't wait much longer to arrive. Galt stepped out onto the porch of his office building, flanked by the last of his hired guns. 6 men now instead of the dozen he'd once commanded. Plenty of the others having quietly slipped town. Once word got around about what happened on that mountain, his face had none of its old, oily confidence left in it. What remained was something tighter, meaner, a cornered man's arithmetic, calculating how much damage he could still do on his way down. Vance, he called out across the square, you come to finish what you started. Come to finish what you started. Silas answered, dismounting slow, favoring the leg that never fully forgave him for that blizzard fight. 14 years of forged debts and stolen land. Ends today, one way or another. The rain had turned the square to mud overnight, thick and churning underfoot, and it was into that mud that the fight spilled once Galt's men opened fire. Evelyn took cover behind a water trough, rifle steady despite her racing heart, while Silas moved through the chaos with the kind of grim, economical purpose that came from a man who'd rehearsed this reckoning in his mind 1,000 times over 14 long winters. His bad legs slowed him, same as always. But what it cost him in speed, he made up for in position. He'd studied this square as a young marshal, knew every angle of cover it offered. And he used that knowledge now, working Galt's remaining men into a corner where their numbers couldn't save them. One by one, they went down or threw up their hands. The mud swallowed spent shells and dropped weapons both. Galt, seeing his last defenses crumble, did what desperate, cowardly men have always done when their own skin is the only thing left worth saving. He grabbed the nearest body, small enough to be useful. A boy no older than 9, son of the town's blacksmith, frozen wide-eyed near the porch steps, and hauled him backward. A pistol pressed hard against the child's temple. "Back off," Galt shouted, voice cracking with panic he was trying and failing to disguise as command. "Back off, or the boy dies right here." The square went dead silent, save for the rain hammering the mud. Silas stopped where he stood. His own weapon was already trained on Galt. A clean shot available, if he wanted to risk it, but a clean shot with a frightened child's head 6 inches from the target wasn't a shot any decent man took. He lowered his weapon and set it down in the mud. "Silas, don't," Evelyn breathed, though she was too far to be heard over the rain. "You want me disarmed. I'm disarmed," Silas called out, hands raised, empty. "This is between you and me." Galt always was. Let the boy go. Something in Galt's calculation shifted. Greed and desperation both scrambling for purchase. And for a long, terrible moment, nobody in that square knew which way the balance would tip. Then came the thunder. It rolled in low across the mud at first, indistinguishable from the storm itself, before the ground began to shake with a rhythm too regular, too purposeful to be weather. Hooves, dozens of them, closing fast from the road south of town. A federal marshal's posse broke into the square at a hard gallop, badges catching what little light the storm allowed, rifles already trained, and at their head rode a marshal who reined up hard enough to send mud flying and shouted a single order that ended Josiah Galt's reign over Blackwood before anyone in that square fully understood what was happening. "Josiah Galt, you are under arrest for fraud, murder, and conspiracy against the United States government." Galt's grip on the boy faltered. In that split second of shock and confusion, the child wrenched free and bolted for his mother's arms, waiting at the edge of the square. Galt, alone now, weapon still raised, but no leverage left to wield it, looked from the posse surrounding him to Silas standing unarmed in the mud, and understood, all at once, that his empire had just ended. The letter Evelyn had slipped a stranger months before, desperate and uncertain whether it would ever reach anyone who cared, had finally arrived exactly where it needed to. They put Galt in irons right there in the square, in front of half the town he'd spent 2 decades exploiting. And if there was any justice sweeter than watching a corrupt man marched away, in the same mud he'd once made other people kneel in. Evelyn couldn't think what it might be. The marshal in charge, a broad graying man named Holt, rode up to where Silas stood and extended a hand down from his saddle. "Vance, heard your name plenty over the years. Figured you were dead or given up." "Neither," Silas said, shaking the offered hand. "Just waiting on proof. Strong enough nobody could bury it again." "Well, you got it. Ledgers you sent held up clean. Judge in the territorial capitals already reviewing them. Galt's looking at the rest of his life behind bars, and every man who took his money to do his dirty work right alongside him." Word spread through the crowd fast, and something in the town square shifted, the anxious hush of the fight breaking open into something more like disbelief, then relief, then slowly, something that resembled real hope. Evelyn made her way to the center of the square, where the last of the forged debt contracts sat stacked in Galt's abandoned office, dragged out into the mud and rain by townsfolk who'd waited years for the chance. She struck a match, cupped it careful against the wind, and touched it to the corner of the pile. The paper caught slow at first, damp from the storm, then found its rhythm and burned bright despite the rain, curling black at the edges, decades of manufactured suffering going up in smoke in front of the very people it had once been used to control. She turned to the gathered crowd, rain plastering her hair to her face, and found she didn't need to raise her voice much to be heard. The whole square had gone quiet, waiting. "No one has the right to put a price on your life or your dignity," she said, her voice carrying clear over the crackling flames and the settling rain. "Not with forged paper, not with hired guns, not with fear. My father built everything he had with his own 2 hands, and a man with a pen and no conscience tried to erase him for it. He didn't succeed. He never will. Not so long as the rest of us remember what real worth looks like, and refuse to let anybody put a number on it ever again." She looked out at the faces watching her. Farmers and shopkeepers, and the families Galt had squeezed for years, and let the moment breathe before she finished. True love and respect can only bloom in the soil of absolute equality. That goes for a town, same as it goes for 2 people. Nobody owns another person's worth. Not here. Not anywhere. Not ever again. So long as we remember to stand up together the way we did today. The applause that followed wasn't loud. Exactly. It was something steadier than that. The quiet, resolute sound of a town, remembering what it felt like to believe in itself again. Marshal Holt offered Silas his old badge back before they left. A formal reinstatement. Full pardon for the record that had been buried against him all those years. Silas turned it over in his palm, a long moment, feeling the weight of 14 years pressed into that small piece of tarnished silver, and then handed it back. "Town's got good people in it now to carry that forward," he said. "I did my part. Reckon I've earned the right to rest." They didn't stay in Blackwood past that evening. The town didn't need them lingering to finish healing itself, and both of them understood there was a difference between finishing a fight and staying to be thanked for it. What mattered had already been set right. The rest belonged to the people who'd lived there. Long after Silas and Evelyn rode back up that mountain trail, the cabin waited for them the way it always had, quiet among the pines. But it felt different arriving home this time. Lighter. The lockbox that had sat hidden beneath the floorboards for 14 years rode home empty, its long purpose finally spent. And Silas set it on the shelf without ceremony. One more piece of the past, finally allowed to simply be the past. Evelyn stood on the porch that evening, watching the sun drop behind the ridgeline, painting the snowfields gold before the color faded to blue, and felt Silas come up quiet behind her, the uneven rhythm of his steps as familiar to her now as her own heartbeat. "Regret coming back up here?" he asked, "after everything down there?" Not for a single second. She leaned back against him, watching the last light fade off the mountains that had once felt like exile and now simply felt like home. This was never a hideout for a lonely, broken man. I don't think it ever really was. Even before I got here. It was just waiting on somebody to come see it the way I do now. Silas wrapped his arms around her, steady, despite the leg that would never fully mend. And for the first time in 14 isolated years, the silence on that mountain held nothing but peace. 2 free souls, standing equal, exactly as they were, with nothing left to prove and nowhere else they'd rather be. Evelyn began this story, standing inside a crowded saloon with a pen in her hand, moments away from signing away her freedom. She was grieving, frightened, and completely alone. Yet, even in that terrible moment, she refused to lower her head. Her courage did not begin when she picked up a rifle or faced an armed killer. It began when she chose not to let Galt see her hand tremble. That small act reminds us that courage is not always loud. Sometimes courage is simply standing straight when the world is trying to make you kneel. Silas, too, carried wounds that could not be seen as easily as the scar across his face or the damage to his leg. For 14 years, he lived alone on the mountain, believing that his failures had made him unworthy of peace, companionship, or love. He saw himself as broken because the world had taught him to measure his value by what his body could no longer do, and by the justice he had once failed to deliver. But Evelyn saw beyond those scars. She understood that a person is not defined by what has been taken from them. We are defined by what we choose to protect, what we continue to believe in, and how we treat others when we have every reason to become bitter. Perhaps the most meaningful moment in their story was not the gunfight, the arrest, or even the destruction of Galt's false contracts. It was the moment Silas placed the cabin key into Evelyn's hand. He had paid her debt, but he never claimed ownership over her future. Instead, he gave her a choice. That simple gesture revealed the difference between possession and love. Possession says, "You belong to me." Love says, "You belong to yourself, and I will respect whatever you choose." Real love does not demand obedience. It does not use fear, guilt, money, or sacrifice as chains. Real love creates a place where both people can stand as equals. Evelyn's transformation also teaches us that being rescued does not mean remaining helpless. Silas saved her from the contract, but he did not become her permanent protector while she remained in the background. He taught her, trusted her, and allowed her to discover her own strength. Later, when Silas lay wounded and defenseless, Evelyn became the one who saved him. The relationship was never about one strong person carrying someone weaker. It was about two wounded people learning to stand beside each other, each becoming strong when the other could not. The people of Blackwood learned the same lesson. Galt controlled the town because he convinced every person that they were alone. Fear kept them silent, and silence made his power appear greater than it truly was. But the moment people began standing together, his empire collapsed. Evil often survives not because it is unbeatable, but because good people believe their resistance will not matter. One letter, one witness, one honest voice, or one courageous act may seem too small to change anything. Yet Evelyn's secret letter brought the federal marshals. Silas's hidden evidence exposed years of corruption. And one town's decision to stop bowing brought an entire reign of cruelty to an end. This story reminds us never to allow another person's judgment to become the measure of our worth. A forged ledger could not erase Evelyn's father. A scar could not make Silas less deserving of love. A debt could not turn a woman into property. And years of fear could not permanently destroy the spirit of an entire town. What is written about us by cruel hands is not necessarily the truth. Our real value is written through our choices, our compassion, our courage, and the lives we help lift along the way. So, wherever you are listening tonight, remember this: you are more than your scars. You are more than your mistakes, your losses, your debts, or the names others have called you. And even if life has driven you into a lonely place, your story does not have to end there. Sometimes healing begins when one person finally sees your true worth. Sometimes freedom begins when someone places a key in your hand. And sometimes justice begins with one frightened person deciding that silence is no longer acceptable. Thank you for staying with Evelyn and Silas until the end of their journey. Tell us in the comments which moment touched you the most, and what would you have done if you had been standing in Evelyn's place? If this story reminded you that dignity, courage, and true love are always worth fighting for, please like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share this story with someone who may need its message today. Until we meet again on another trail beneath the wide western sky, take care of one another and never let anyone place a price on your worth. This story is a work of fiction, created purely for entertainment purposes. Any names, characters, events, locations, or situations portrayed in this narrative are either the product of the author's imagination or used fictitiously, and any resemblance to real persons, living or dead, is entirely coincidental.